Hello and welcome to another episode of the Aim High podcast. I'm so excited to introduce today's guest, Stefanie Ward. Miss Ward is an experienced executive and leader in the world of retail, luxury, and customer experience. Miss Ward has held senior leadership roles at some of the most iconic brands in the world, including Louis Vuitton, Sephora, and most recently, Neiman Marcus Group. At Neiman Marcus, she served as Chief Retail and Customer Officer. Over the course of her 20-plus year career, she's driven innovation across in-store, digital, and mobile channels, leading large teams through transformation. Please welcome Miss Ward to the Aim High podcast. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Ben. Love this opportunity and love what you're doing.
Thanks. So to start off, because this podcast is centered around being an Asian American leader in business, it is important to first understand each guest's childhood and upbringing as an Asian American. Ideas instilled within you from your parents and environment may have helped you become successful in where you are today. So could you please explain your childhood situation growing up, where, siblings, and what were family dynamics like?
Yeah, it's a fun one. So, I kind of have a classic story where my parents were first generation immigrants here to the United States from Taiwan. They came here in their 20s and just grew up with really, really humble roots. We started my family, we lived back in Queens. I was born in Manhattan. So, really live in that kind of pocket of lots of generation immigrant communities and families. My extended family, both on my mom and my dad's side, also a majority of them landed in Queens. So, I grew up with a lot of my extended family members, a lot of weekends together, spent a lot of time with my grandparents on my father's side. And because of that, I kind of had this ecosystem and bubble where I was able to really maintain even language skills. I speak Mandarin fluently, conversationally. Can't read or write, but I can speak it pretty well because I grew up with a lot of grandparents and family members. But you're very much instilled, I would say, as many first generation immigrant families from all different type of cultures and backgrounds, Asian American included, is you really are, like I said, humble, but also grow up sometimes in a mindset of scarcity. So maybe not as willing to take risks, which I learned to do a little bit later in life on how to kind of find my voice and break out there. Because you never want to take anything for granted. But with that, had an amazing childhood, amazing supportive parents, and eventually, I was a single child for about almost 10 years. And then my younger sister came to life about when I was 9.5. So it was one of the best things that has happened to me. I couldn't say that we were super close growing up because we had almost a 10-year age difference. So something like when I was a senior in high school, I'm all worried about colleges and where I'm going, and she's worried about Barney. It was a very different, and we got a lot closer later in life, and now she's definitely my best friend and just someone I love having. And but yeah, I grew up some Asian stereotype families. Maybe some competition of so and so's daughter and son are in this Ivy League school and got these grades and got this career. But for the most part, my parents also really wanted to make sure that I found my voice, that they were supportive with me, and we really grew that together as an ecosystem to blend both the Eastern and Western kind of values, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And how did your parents' experiences as immigrants influence your perspective on work and especially success?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the most beautiful story for both of my parents is when they first came, my mother was very educated. She was, kind of an A-plus student, everything she did. She, had all her ducks in a row, was studying accounting, bachelor's, master's, everything. And my dad was kind of honestly, a wandering artist. He was so good at painting, and he did one of those classic kind of Chinese, landscape paintings growing up. Academics were never really his thing. And then he met my mother and realized that while he came here and went to the Fashion Institute of Technology and pursued a lot of his skills, he actually wanted to pivot and do something different. And so he actually went back to school a little bit later in life to get his associate's degree and then his bachelor's degree and then his master's degree in a very short amount of time. Wow. And one of the most impressionable things was just seeing how hard my parents worked and how much hard work and grit paid off. But also that I really grew up being I can't take that for granted. And one of the things that really was the most impressionable is that my dad ended up getting his master's at Columbia University, which is where I ended up doing my undergrad at. because I vividly remember being 6 years old and visiting him on campus on the weekends, delivering food and riding the bus and the subway to get there.
Mm.
So lots of poetic memories, but for me, it's really around just how hard they worked and to not take things for granted. And, grit really can pave the way, and just recognizing the value of the sacrifices they made along the way as well.
And that's definitely like a theme when I talk to other people about like their parents and like hard work and like setting a foundation for their children. So, did you ever feel any pressure to conform to certain expectations, either from your family or your broader community or your school? And how did you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, a lot. My parents were not the typical tiger Asian parents.
Mm.
There was at some point where they did crack the whip on me a bit. It was like, oh, you're going out a couple too many nights a week, and like, where are your SATs? And make
Yeah.
sure I didn't sit. But they never were like, you have to be a doctor, you have
Mm-hmm.
to be a lawyer, or any type of stereotypical path. But they certainly wanted to make sure that I would get the potential of the opportunities. But really, I put probably the most pressure on myself.
Mm.
I ended up in high school being like, I got to do 8 activities. I got to volunteer at the hospital, and I got to like do a sport and everything to kind of build up that college resume.
Mm-hmm.
Extended family, community wise, probably felt that pressure a bit more. Like I mentioned, there's always be this kind of like reference to there's perfect so and so who's doing so and kind of like passive aggressively dropping hints of what I should probably be pursuing and thinking. So and so's SAT scores were la la la. So definitely in the Asian American community, you're just going to get that. And like I said, that's probably not just Asian American, but a lot of first generation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but my parents were always really supportive to kind of let me lead the way. And honestly, I put so much pressure on myself,
Mm.
and probably more so in my earlier years and my later years, because I just had this kind of natural drive to want to achieve and do my best. And quite frankly, had to figure out later in life how to fail better,
Mm.
embrace failure, and not be so wound up in perfection.
Mm. And were there any specific experiences, events, or learned lessons during your childhood that you believe set some foundation for your future success, or like just lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as a lesson learned now, but back then it was kind of more like a childhood dream. Right before my sister was born, so a lot happened between the ages of, call it, 8 and 10. My parents decided to open up their own mom and pop ice cream shop. It was
Mm.
something my dad had always dreamed of kind of being a self entrepreneur on Main Street. And so they picked this lovely location in Garden City, Long Island. Um, and you're 9 years old, and I had unlimited ice cream every day, every weekend, whenever I wanted. But looking back on it, it was my first, I would say, customer-facing retail experience,
Mm.
and I didn't think of it at the time because I was just focused on making myself endless numbers of sundaes and shakes and whatever else it may be, testing every flavor that came in through the door every week from the delivery distributor. But it was my first opportunity to really be customer-facing, to do things
Mm.
like stand out on the sidewalk and hand out flyers and try to drive in traffic, to customer service and greeting everyone with a smile and asking how their day was, and knowing that that made a pretty big difference in impression to get them to feel more connected to our brand, our shop. And but also I got to see the underbelly of how hard it is to run a mom and pop ice cream store.
Mm.
And if anything, I think subliminally it got me more just connected to um, all customer facing experiences, and just thinking of everything on that side, which ultimately led to a career in retail. So
Mm-hmm.
again, not something I thought of, or kind of had that immediate click and thought when I was 9 years old, but in hindsight, I know it made a pretty big impression on me, from everything around running a business to feeling connected to a customer and a product that you just really cared about, and just what that service and experience should feel like.
Mm-hmm. And were you like interested in business at that age, or like did you realize that you wanted to do something in maybe like retail or like consumer, or was that just like a coincidental thing that you then ended up pursuing?
Yeah, I don't think I was able to articulate like I love everything customer facing. I love consumer
Mm-hmm.
products and retail until much later. But I knew that I love the energy of just being surrounded by different people. And I knew that I had a lot of interest in just business in general, probably because my mom was an accountant, and she actually had me like help her sort checks, like from her business, like her work, when I was like a young age, and paid me like $5 to sort out checks. So you kind of were like immersed in a little bit. I had like an opportunity to do internships in New York City, even when I was 13, and not again with like a plan to say I need to do this to make it into a retail career, but I just always loved everything that was dynamic and ever changing. I kind of love the challenge of learning something different and new, and I guess retail and everything around business just gives you that opportunity. So that's how I ended up pursuing kind of that path from the beginning.
Yeah. And what were some of those internships that you like briefly mentioned at like 13?
Oh my God, I had a smattering of things. So, like at 13 years old, my mom had a coworker whose husband worked at the Belgian consulate and had an office in the Empire State Building. I mean, kind of like cool and dreamy. And so I would commute. During the summer, I commuted basically 3 or 4 days a week from Long Island into the city. Try to put on my like best little cute like skirt suit or whatever that might be, and basically just helped him like organize files, or he had a lot of like dictating like recordings and I would help him type it out. So kind of just being in that environment kind of made me also grow up probably a little bit fast. I can't remember what he actually dictated, but I just remember like I was like my job is just type really fast and record everything out. And then I did things like work at the local library in my hometown. Worked at a restaurant, so again, kind of also very customer hospitality facing as a hostess. And then I would say the job that actually taught me a ton of skills was being a telemarketer for Colorado Prime Foods at the age of 16. Because it was all about cold calling. And if there's one thing that I think is such a underrated skill set and underrated experience is sales. Because you really got to put yourself out there. You really got to figure out like how to close that deal, or how to find a way to really connect with people in a very short amount of time. And you got to deal with rejection really well too. So kind of teach you through that failure point pretty quickly as well. So but yeah, I was everywhere. I actually never folded jeans and worked for the Gap, and I actually wanted to, but my parents convinced me otherwise because the pay rate was much higher for some of these other jobs.
Yeah. So now we will move on to the education and early career part of the podcast. So the first question is, what was your college experience like, and did you know what you wanted to pursue as a career in college?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, and kind of, you had said this is obviously a platform for a lot of Asian Americans, is when I was growing up in Long Island and then eventually New Jersey. So that's where I spent all of my years growing up in my kind of, K through 12 years, if you will. I didn't have a lot of Asian American friends. I didn't have a lot of Chinese friends. We had Chinese people in our community, but it was mostly like Jewish, Italian, and Caucasian. And so for the majority of my upbringing, I actually identify with obviously my Chinese heritage on the family side, but not in my social circles. When I got to Columbia, one, because I kind of like, relived or fulfilled the 6-year old dream, right, of visiting her daddy on campus and now being on campus herself. That's when I actually started immersing myself more into Chinese Asian Americans. Felt that there was so much more opportunity to identify with what Asian American really means. And so, had the opportunity to engage in a lot more of the social activities. We had things like Chinese Students Club, Asian Alliance, ICASU, which is like East Coast Asian Student Union, and also immerse myself more in learning the language. Both, I was able to speak it well, but not read or write it well. And then alongside that was trying to figure out like what do I want to do. Initially, I actually wanted to really study psychology because, again, over time, I just had like gravitational pull to wanting to know people better, understanding the science of that. And get real nerdy with kind of why people do what they do. My parents are like, no, we're not paying for a college education for you to be a shrink. So you got to choose a different profession. So I ended up majoring in economics and also in psychology, so I can kind of find a balance, which for retail worked out really well, because it really is all about not just the customer side of it, but when you're working for retail, you've got tens of thousands of people on the front line, and many a times to make it with the customer, you have to make it and motivate the people who are on the front lines every day. So So yeah, weaved in and out in terms of those two studies, and got really involved in some Asian American clubs and activities. But also was grateful to be in New York City, where I had the chance to add on even more internships. I worked for a private equity small firm at one point, helping him look through pitch decks. Worked at Deloitte Consulting for a little bit, kind of back in the day when they were starting their consulting practice. Worked at Goldman Sachs, and but the city, New York City, can offer you that, and so I really took advantage of that to continue to learn what I did, and it ended up in investment banking. So that
Hmm.
became kind of the first thing. But even before that job, I would say the most pivotal moment in my time in college was I graduated in 2002. So if you think about history and dates, 9/11 happened my senior year. And so a lot kind of, again, made you grow up pretty fast when you're at the precipice of going out in life and trying to be an adult, and having a pretty big world event happen around you. So, and being in New York City at the same time.
Yeah. And from your background, I saw that you started your career in investment banking at Merrill Lynch. And what did that process look like getting that first job? And what did you do at Merrill Lynch?
Yeah, so I didn't know I wanted to be an investment banker.
Hmm.
I knew I was interested in the field of consumer retail, but not really knowing, like, do I be a buyer at Bloomingdale's? Do I become a marketer at Pepsi? Those are some of the other opportunities available. And quite honestly, I chose investment banking because someone told me that you can make the most amount of money then. So lesson one in hindsight: don't always choose the dollars. You can try it, but that's probably not the best, like, decision making, kind of measurement and stick, is just
Hmm.
going after the biggest paycheck. But anyways, I also ended up in a really wonderful, amazing development program called Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, which gave a lot of minority-facing candidates the opportunity to work in different fields and sectors, and but just an amazing program, amazing community and network altogether. But then come senior year, I wouldn't say I was like, oh, I want to be an investment banker. But again, 9/11 happened, and 50% of my class and friends didn't even have a job coming out.
Hmm.
I got my summer internship and got a returning offer, and it was like, okay, you're going to take this,
Yeah.
because the job market is not, flourishing right now. And so, but I enjoy, kind of my internship, the people I had met, and was like, you know what, if I can kill a couple of birds with one stone, like, get a good paycheck, work in retail consumer, then I can learn some skills along the way. Like, who knows? This could be a really great combination of it all. So that's kind of how it started.
Hmm. And at Merrill Lynch, did you like get to choose that you were part of like global retail and consumer products group, or like how did you land that like specific sector?
Funny you asked that question, because that was the intent. But because graduating in 2002 and entering a new analyst class that was also half the size of the previous class,
Hmm.
I ended up being a generalist. So while I was still mostly tethered to consumer retail, basically had to support industrials. I learned a lot about, like, Danaher and Tyco and some pretty big paper products,
Hmm.
healthcare, chemicals, logistics. Not really the sectors I would have picked, but learned a lot. And I would say that's another lesson, is just take every opportunity to learn.
Hmm.
And so I'm grateful for that. But yeah, it wasn't always fun because I was working on things that I had absolutely no interest in doing at the time, and it was hard. The
Hmm.
typical 90 hours, all of that was still very much standing, and we didn't have AI or Excel spreadsheets that spit things out for you. You actually had to create it from, like, A1, and
Yeah.
flip books, and there was no cloud, and you had to deliver books to offices. So different type of grit.
Yeah. And what were some of your biggest takeaways or lessons from your time in investment banking that helped shape your career going forward?
Um, I would say a couple of things. I mean, learned a lot of hard skills. Still love a good old Excel spreadsheet and some spreadsheet cuts, and love building a model when I get a chance to do one, even if it's a small and really lame one. But really, I would say the biggest one was, I learned that back then I didn't really know where my voice was, and I didn't know how to
Mm.
advocate for myself. And it was not an easy environment as a younger, looking Asian American female. It just wasn't. It was not friendly for that type. I had some pretty good mentors that protected me,
Hmm.
but the competitiveness of it with some others were hard. And so, I also just learned very quickly of, like, you really have to enjoy the environment you're in.
Mm.
You're not going to be at your best if you don't feel like you can be yourself. And that was a promise I made to myself when I decided to leave investment banking was make sure to always stay true to yourself because you're never going to be at your best if you don't feel like you can be.
Mm-hmm. And that goes into the next question, which is why did you make the pivot from investment banking to then go to Time Inc. and then to Bath and Body Works?
Yeah, I mean, the hard thing was, I had every intention, even though I was miserable and not necessarily happy all the time. Again, I made some really great connections, even people who I still connect with and talk to today. So it wasn't like all lost for anything. But it was really hard because I decided to quit the program before 2 years. I was so burnt out. I was
Mm.
23. I had gained like, forget freshman 15. It was like analyst 25 pounds. I had so much cortisol running through my body, lack of sleep. I had like acne. I never even had teenage acne, but I had like 22-year-old acne. And it was just, it felt so awful. And I basically just emotionally crashed. And it's probably the
Mm.
first time in my life that I quit something. I never
Mm.
quit anything in my life. But I had a friend who was a third year analyst who had left the program and she joined Martha Stewart Publishings and went to consumer marketing and said, I think you would like this. And it's really great transferable skill sets because it's all very data oriented, but you get to be much more part of a real consumer facing product, magazines, which
Mm-hmm.
are not as cool today, but they were really cool back then. Um, and so I did that. I applied for a program to join Time Inc., not knowing, not saying I was going to do publishing, but just more like this is a great pivot for me and a great way to really get closer to the consumer product. And that really worked out. And also met some amazing leaders and friends who I'm still connected to this day, who kind of caught me when I was really frail and trying to figure out life, and gave me a purpose and gave me a home to really build some really amazing kind of wins around.
Yeah, and then how did you transition to Bath and Body Works after your time at Time Inc.?
Yeah, well, in between Time magazines and Bath and Body Works, I decided to go pursue my MBA.
Mm.
But at that time, I was like, you know what? I'm going to follow my gut. I really do love the consumer retail sector. I still don't know what role exactly I want to do in it,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to pursue that. And so I decided to get my MBA. Had always thought about getting my MBA even when I was an undergrad. And I'm also very happy my mom pushed me to take my GMATs when I was a senior in high school, or in college. She
Mm.
was like, "You're never going to have such a fresh mind and skills to, take a test and be." So I'm really glad I did that because I was
Mm.
able to work and also apply, and it was during business school that I made the commitment to myself that what, I'm really wanting to get into consumer retail. So even though I interview for consulting firms and everything, I waited till late spring of my first year to then score an internship with L Brands. And at the time, it was Victoria's Secret, Bath and Body Works,
Mm.
amazing brands that I loved shopping
Mm-hmm.
at and being consumer of,
Yeah.
and was able to get into their summer internship program that was centralized to the portfolio mothership of L Brands.
Mm-hmm. And what did your day-to-day role look like at Bath and Body Works for that like first internship?
Yeah, so when I got, my first internship there between my first and second year was all oriented around athleisure wear. Actually, it was even before Lululemon entered the U.S. market. I
Mm.
had the opportunity to do a lot of in-home consumer research studies. Again, a lot of data-oriented consumer research and analyses, and really be able to pull together conclusions and thought recommendations on how to launch a completely new product category for the company.
Mm.
And then when I got back to L Brands after graduating from my MBA at Harvard, I entered Bath and Body Works. And so it was kind of a nice little feeder program. There were a couple of us that had done this kind of centralized summer internship program, if you will, and then fed off into multiple divisions within the company across Victoria's Secret and Bath and Body Works. And when I first joined, I was a product development manager, which means I was basically a owner of a sub brand within the company, and the product that I was staffed on or had to lead was wallflowers. And so for
Mm.
those who are not, if you're not familiar with a wallflower, it's basically a Glade plugin.
Mm.
And so my initial day in and day out was to really work on pricing strategy, fragrance launches, finding ways to really drive the product development piece behind it. And I can tell you that it wasn't the most riveting at first, but I had opportunity to make it a little bit more cool. So
Mm.
that was probably my first, I would say, role, because I was at Bath and Body Works for about 2.5 years, where I had the opportunity to reinvent a category and test a lot. Like to this day, testing is just so important, which is why, I say things like, you have to accept failure. You have to be able to test, because if you don't test, you're not going to learn. You're not going to get the recipe right. And that role really helped me get the opportunity to get something right and scale it, and now leave a legacy of what that category is now today.
And then how did the opportunity to get a job at Louis Vuitton come about?
Ooh, this was a fun one. So this was through network and relationships, which is probably like another theme I know you probably have heard from a lot of your constituents here on this platform, because you just never know who you're going to meet, and you never know what those relationships will bring later in life. But yeah, I had somebody who I worked with at L Brands that then basically had his recruiting team call me. And at first, I was like, wait a second, Louis Vuitton? Love the brand. I mean, who doesn't love Louis Vuitton? It's gorgeous, it's beautiful, it's delightful. But I actually felt, I was like, I don't kind of do Devil Wears Prada. I grew up with really humble roots, never owned a luxury handbag in my life, admired it. But I'm much more like a 3 for 10 anti-back soap, like, 2 for 20 wallflowers or candles type of girl. I interviewed with the brand, gave it a shot, and just fell in love with the story and the brand DNA, and also the people. The people were just amazing and such high caliber, as I've been lucky to surround myself with in many of my jobs, but just has so much rich history and such a kind of opportunity, and also to be part of a global company that was so revered, was hard to say no. And it was also a role that was brand new. And that's something I have started to learn about myself, is I love taking on roles that are brand new. I love defining them, and that gave me an opportunity to do that.
And as you held many roles at Louis Vuitton, can you maybe walk us through each of those progressions?
Sure. Yeah. So when I first joined, the role on paper from a title perspective was manager of client development. And it was a new function and a role that really was set out to say, how do we continue to strengthen the relationships we have with our customers through the relationship that you have between the associate as well as a customer. Back then, everything was still more or less on paper. We, digitize it eventually, but it was really about like a client book, and I used to call it like your friendship book. You would tag and understand when to reach out to people. It's kind of your mini CRM system, if you will. And again, drew a lot of my, experience even from doing CRM and Time Inc. on how to address all of that. But the thing I love the most was spending time in the stores. So I spent a lot of time in the stores, as I did even in my Bath and Body Works role, to kind of test things out, talking to associates, talking to customers, understanding where's the gap, what problems you need to solve, what's not going right, like what's good and what's honestly sucks wind, and like that we need to do different and better with better tools, or how make your job better for a lot of our associates. And I spent so much time in the stores that I raised my hand to want to actually lead either Fifth Avenue at the time, or to really just immerse myself in field leadership. And I had the opportunity to cover someone's maternity leave, and moved to DC for a couple of months, then moved back to New York. And when I did, there was an opportunity to oversee 14 stores in the Northeast area.
Wow.
And then from there, had a chance to then move to San Francisco to oversee all of the Northwest, and then had a chance to move to Canada to be the country manager for Canada. So very quickly, I was able to progress because, one, I was very mobile at the time, wasn't married, didn't have kids, unencumbered, but also just really, fell in love, I would say, with the opportunity to build more skill sets, be in different places, and learned a ton. My first job managing people, I was terrible. I applied everything like this, like annoying person with an MBA with like a PowerPoint or Excel spreadsheet for everything. And the reality is when you are working in the front lines and when you are dealing with retail, it's really about what you are doing in that moment in time, not what you have perfectly laid out. So a lot of great lessons, but a lot of great mentors. My boss at the time was so patient, and really gave me some great direct feedback, because I know she believed in me, but it was hard. And other different type of tears were shed in that role versus investment banking. So.
And as the VP and like general manager and head of Canada, what did a typical work week look like for you then at your highest role at Louis Vuitton?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. I was based in Toronto, but because Canada obviously spans east to west, I traveled a
Mm-hmm.
lot. So this is very different from my roles within Louis Vuitton when I was in New York or San Francisco because everything was more regional. You could do a lot more day trips. I can go to Vegas. I can go to, um, Seattle from San Francisco. Like it was a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was in Canada, I also just had my own dedicated team. I also felt this huge connection that most of our clientele, particularly in Toronto and especially in Vancouver, were Asian.
Mm-hmm.
That there was like a different strategy that I could also apply and think about to really, motivate customers differently and think through many didn't live in Canada but visited Canada or cross province lines in order to shop because you didn't have a location in every single province. So thought through a lot of that, but I spent a lot of time in the field, and of
Mm-hmm.
course also had to spend a lot of time in New York and sometimes Paris as a headquarter, which sounds a lot more glamorous than it does traveling that much. But it was really exciting to be able to just be in a place where I had full 360 view on everything,
Mm-hmm.
because every function kind of rolled up into me and had my ability to really kind of make my mark on what I saw the opportunity for Canada to be, which is not just a copycat version of the US. So being able to identify that was pretty fun.
Mm-hmm. And how did you see those like differences between like the U.S. and like Canada markets?
Yeah, I mean, one, there was just really high concentration of Asian clientele, and I think you have to think very differently about, where their journey starts. Their journey is not going to start because I, on a weekend, decided to pop into, the Yorkville Mall in Toronto. It's because I came here to visit my son or daughter or family
Mm-hmm.
member in Toronto. They may be in college, and it's like a real dedicated shopping excursion and trip. It's also just things that you like, colors, knowing that how big Chinese New Year is in terms of a holiday versus what
Mm-hmm.
you might experience in other parts of the U.S., and how to lean more into that. And just also just had to think that it's a culture that's so multifaceted. Canada is. I know we like to
Mm-hmm.
think the U.S. is a melting pot, but I really learned just how diverse there was in terms of different pockets. And Montreal is very different from Toronto as a micro versus Vancouver, and just how to even think about city to city geographical differences when it came to customer needs and also associate needs.
Mm-hmm. And where do you think you made like the biggest impact in your role?
I would say, just being part of the core team that really came up with client development as a function,
Mm-hmm.
and not just as a CRM system where you're just like spitting out labels and emails or anything, but really finding that connection between the associate and the customer and how to build that relationship over time, but also set up programs to actually drive that.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say in Canada, when I was there, and what also probably will be your next question, like what then took me to Sephora, was
Yeah.
it was at the time where luxury, or e-commerce in general, particularly luxury e-commerce, was starting. So even
Mm-hmm.
starting to think through like what omni-channel really means, and the opportunity to build some programs around that was pretty exciting.
Mm-hmm. So then why did you end up deciding to leave Louis Vuitton after 6 years and to go to Sephora?
Yeah, the beauty of Louis Vuitton was it was part of LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, the parent group. Obviously, headquarters based in Paris, but also many divisions across the world, and a
Mm-hmm.
huge portfolio of brands. And so I had made some connections and some, folks I had known, and I also just love Sephora as a customer. I mean, as a person who grew up in the age of Sephora, it's like a candy store. And I know your sisters probably love it too, and a lot of others too, and boys love it too, men love it too. And so at that time, I really started getting curious about digital. Like I
Mm-hmm.
said, it was kind of at the precipice for luxury e-commerce. Folks still weren't convinced you could buy a $5,000 bag sight unseen, which is not even a consideration point today. But I was like, I really want to learn digital. And a lot of those core functions of innovation and proprietary kind of thought leadership were coming out of Paris, wasn't looking to move to the headquarters. And Sephora was a great opportunity. And through talking to people, met their chief digital officer. So again, another organization where I had the opportunity to meet amazing people and develop amazing relationships that still stand today.
Mm-hmm.
But she was looking for somebody who had retail store experience to help her think about how to connect the two channels. And I was a retail person looking to learn digital.
Mm.
And so through conversation, we kind of took a chance on each other to be able to do that. And so, yeah, the 2.5 years there was really spent around, scratching my digital itch, if you will, that I now have the ability to build product and drive really awesome digital experiences. But also, like I said, learn a lot. And I actually took a couple of steps down in title to do it.
Mm.
So I could have just continued to kind of rise in bigger countries and territories in Louis Vuitton, but something in my gut said, you know what, like learn something new and do something different and
Hmm.
make yourself a little bit more different, but also just do what your heart is telling you that you kind of want to do and want to satisfy.
Hmm. And what was like your favorite like project or like initiative you took on at Sephora?
Oh my gosh, there were so many. I mean, I oversaw anything from the call center, which I feel like the call center always gets like the shorter end of the stick because we're like the call center. But I mean, the number of people who call in the call center, like every single voice matters.
Hmm.
And so I had the opportunity to make it more efficient, elevate the service, build out a team that really helped support that, even help drive some of our social monitoring and presence that we didn't necessarily had 100% stood up, but I had an amazing person on my team who had the expertise to do that. But then all the way to then I had the chance to, towards the tail end of my time there, oversee our services business. So this is where when you are passing a Sephora store and you see all these chairs set up for people to get makeovers, it's a pretty
Mm.
big business that we were driving through that from services, and the opportunity to create a online platform, an online booking platform that showed you every day at a Sephora near you what's happening at the Sephora store near you.
Mm.
That was super fun because it was the best intersection of physical and digital and really thinking through the client experience on how to weave it through from end to end, but also just make Sephora that much more special because you felt so much more empowered to know what was happening, and also the opportunity to save some information that you had from makeovers into a digital wallet,
Mm.
because inevitably whenever you get stuff done and maybe not as relevant to you, but for any of your female kind of audience members, they probably would resonate. But you get this beautiful makeover, and then you're like, I don't know what they did on me. And we were able to digitize that experience. So super fun to be able to do everything end to end and across both the physical and the digital channel.
Hmm. And now we will move on to the third part of the podcast, talking about current career. So we will talk now about your most recent role at Neiman Marcus. So how did that opportunity to move to Neiman Marcus come about from Sephora?
Yeah, so funny enough, the same person who had called me to move from Bath and Body Works to Louis Vuitton, who I didn't actually get a chance to work with for a very long time, was then the same person who called me for the opportunity at Neiman Marcus. So again, you just never know what connections you're going to have and who is going to be. And so that was Neiman Marcus' CEO, Jeff Ramdonk, who had just taken the role in Neiman Marcus and was looking to build out a team. I had now built out some really great experiences at Sephora that cross physical and digital. And Neiman Marcus was looking for someone to lead also their omni services and omni opportunities. And so that also required us to move from San Francisco to Dallas. Dallas was not necessarily like, a town that I was like, I'm going to live in Dallas. I didn't have any family there, no connections. Always been a bi-coastal girl, New York and San Francisco.
Hmm.
But we came to Dallas, my husband and I, and our boxer at the time, no kids, and was just excited to embrace another yet amazing brand that I had known so much,
Mm.
especially with my partnership with Louis Vuitton back in the day, and just again the history and heritage of it, and the opportunity to continue to push the envelope on digitizing experiences or connecting the experiences, because Neiman Marcus is already pretty known for being a digital pioneer, and so it was really a privilege and also an exciting to kind of add on to that.
You've held several senior roles at Neiman Marcus. Can you walk us through your progression and how your responsibilities evolved over each role?
Yeah, so when I first joined there, it was very much, I would call it, a strategy and like functional role.
Mm.
No longer, since leaving Louis Vuitton, I was no longer overseeing the field. At Sephora, I didn't oversee the field. I oversaw the call center, the customer care center, but I didn't oversee stores anymore. And when
Mm.
I came to Neiman Marcus, that was the same. And actually, at that time, was intentionally trying to be more in strategic facing roles, transformation roles. I realized I really loved that and felt that I had to make a choice of, do I go on the strategy, transformation, functional track, or do I stay on the field leadership track? But over time, again, I spent so much time with our associates. I was very deeply rooted with both the digital and the stores team at Neiman Marcus. And over time, there's opportunity for me to add back on some store responsibilities. So about a year and a half into my time at the company, we restructured and I had the opportunity to keep my client development or customer engagement functions and omni-channel functions and add on the West Coast stores, which for me was a familiar territory because I had done part of the West Coast at Louis Vuitton. And then from there, also then expanded and eventually took on all the stores and was able to build out more functions. And also for a point in time, also took on our digital e-commerce business. And also had a chance to launch things like our mobile app and continue kind of proprietary product developments that we had around our associate facing tool called Connect. So I got, looking back, I never would have written this out when I joined the company 6.5 years ago. But with every single step, I just, showed curiosity, the ability to really motivate not only, the field workers, but also my peers and inspire them to think differently. And I think it just presented me with the opportunity over time to just keep kind of adding on to this foundation I had built, but also with just amazing support through different leaders I had the opportunity to work with and be surrounded by.
And what did your role look like as the chief retail officer? And what were some key challenges or goals you were focused on during that time?
Yeah, so at the highest level, basically, I oversaw all 36 of our full line stores, 5 of our off price stores, so 41 different locations, over $3 billion gross merchandise value, and with over 6,000 associates. Wow. So really full P&L general manager of a pretty sizable piece of our business. And so, it would be a bunch of different things. There'd be sessions or times where I would also still be involved in kind of the omni-channel part. So I would be in a lot of steering committees, working on what our personalization roadmap might be, some of our, technical capabilities. Like I said, I had the opportunity to build our proprietary associate-facing selling tool and think about ways to expand that. And then I would travel a lot too. I would be out in the field. I've always believed and now have learned that the answers are always in the stores. The answers are always with the people who are closest to the customer, not in some Zoom meeting where you're behind a closed door and trying to figure out numbers on a spreadsheet. You need to get out there. And so I had to always balance the two because I had to think about what the current, actions that we needed to drive business every day, all the way to what are we going to do in 12 months or 36 months, figuring out what a longer range sustainability plan would be, but also making sure I kept it real by staying connected with all the people that really made it happen every day.
And besides being connected to the people that, like you said, make stuff happen, what were some key factors you thought about when trying to improve the customer experience across in-store, digital, and mobile channels?
Yeah, another pretty classic phrase in retail is detail. And so I think, really not only just listening to what people are saying, but how do you, everything around omni-channel is about connecting the experience. So every day I had to think about how do I be a dot connector? And how do I also just put one of our most important assets at the center of the experience, which, yes, it's a customer, but it's really the associate behind it. Relationships matter so much, and as the world continues to evolve, especially in commerce that can be very transactional, the things that are going to matter the most is how the experience made you feel. And sometimes it's going to be purely digital and other times it's going to be with a person, but no matter what, you have to find a way to make sure that every step of the journey the customer feels special and they feel connected to the brand. And we didn't get it right all the time, and I know we didn't because I got emails from customers telling me that we didn't get it right, but that just gave us more of the opportunity to think about what are we missing and how do we improve it and what do we have to invest in order to make that happen.
And what were some of the most challenging aspects of your job at Neiman Marcus, and how did you overcome those difficulties?
There's probably a professional and a personal, because in this time of 6.5 years, I went from, just having my husband and my boxer dog to also getting pregnant twice, going through infertility challenges, like a lot of just life stuff happening all together, and then having two wonderful children added to our family. So, right off the bat, just managing that journey in the midst of COVID, just throw that in, like have a baby and then the world shuts down and figure it out. All of that was pretty challenging. No one's going to teach you how to no, there's no like perfect, playbook or guidebook that kind of teaches, but being surrounded by people who really just lifted me, again, saw me through tears. I guess I cry more than I give myself credit to, but like, you just have to be real and keep it real. And I also realized that the more I kept it real, the more it made other people feel that it was okay to sometimes not be okay, because life can be hard. And raising humans, again, there's no perfect playbook for it. So that was probably one of the hardest things altogether. From a purely professional, retail is an ever evolving industry. And as my role got bigger, sometimes you have to make really hard decisions. And one of the hardest decisions I've always had to make is anytime we may have had to do a restructuring. And not because, the company's in a terrible spot or anything, but just more like that's what you have to do. You always have to prune. You always have to, think about ways to make things more efficient. And sometimes what comes with that is, restructuring and having those conversations, knowing that you have amazing people who have, lives and families, and you're about to make a decision that can really affect them, is not something I ever took lightly, and never got easier, no matter how many times you did it.
And what were some of the initiatives you were most proud of, and why?
Yeah, I mean, definitely some of the innovation and transformation I had a chance to be a part of. That's what drew me to the company. That's why I wanted to fulfill. So the opportunity to build new digital products, also acquire, we acquired a machine learning SaaS-based company along the way. And so it was fun to kind of bring back my investment banking skills and figure out how to do a little M&A deal on the side with our board members. But really the thing I was probably the most proud of is the culture we had a chance to build. And I really think that becoming a parent, a working parent, gave me the opportunity, insight to be more vulnerable and to be more human. That being robotic and being tough and being, kind of the just know it all because you're supposed to, because you're a chief something, actually doesn't get you the equity, and nor does it get you the answers that you need. And so the ability to really formulate a culture, develop a team, develop the full strategy, and be able to say, and call it our own, and kind of know that, we got what we put into it. I was immensely proud. And probably the last thing, because I actually had a chance to talk about this recently too, was really, I would say, a huge advocate of changing our parental leave policy. I know, Ben, for you and maybe some audience members, a little bit too far away to think about family planning and building, or at least I hope you're not all on that right now. But, the U.S. is terrible with their maternity policies or parental policies. And it is on and then, states and also on companies to think about how to do that. And so we went from the minimal leave of 6 to 8 weeks paid to every single parent, regardless of type of birth or gender, to having 16 weeks of paid parental leave. And that was huge. And that came from my own personal experience of having my first, and again, being in the middle of a pandemic. It was like, I cannot believe I'm back at work with the child on my lap because I can't find a nanny because we have a worldwide pandemic on our hands.
Yeah. And why did you decide to leave Neiman Marcus just like a couple months ago? And what are you now planning on doing in the future?
Yeah, it's definitely been a bittersweet, but so proud of what we built, and we ultimately got to a point where we were acquired by a Hudson Bay company that owns Saks Fifth Avenue, and they've now formed a new company called Saks Global. And again, love the team, have done a lot, but just it came to a natural kind of reflection point of continuing that journey or taking, potentially a bit of a break, which is what I'm doing right now, and pivoting, spending some time with my kids, but also a lot of the new kind of centralized headquarters, a lot of activity that happened in New York. We weren't looking to move to New York City. So again, at one point in my life, I can move anywhere on a dime. Call me and I'll go to Toronto. Call me, I'll go to San Francisco. Call me, I'll go anywhere. But, really had to really think this through of what our family wanted. And so it just came to a natural breaking point, which again was bittersweet, but super proud of, the journey we have been able to take up to this point.
And now we will move on to the fourth part of the podcast about challenges and overcoming obstacles as an Asian American. So, being an Asian American in leadership roles comes with its own sets of challenges. What were some of the obstacles you faced in your industry, particularly due to your background?
Yeah, I think it's so funny. I actually just talked to my dad recently. I love talking to my parents. I don't do it as often as I should, but every time I do, it's deep and we share a lot and reflect a lot. And he said something to the point of, when you were growing up, I was afraid that you were going to be too meek and too vulnerable. But somewhere along the way, you found your voice. And I think that is very true of a lot of Asian American generation folks, but particularly for females. And so, that's something where, and I keep trying to think like what clicked, because we're trying to think about like what made that happen. And it really was, I would say, later in high school and then in college, I really found my voice. And then my voice was tested in investment banking, as I was saying. That was something where like, I know if I wanted to see, I would have to play, a certain role, a certain part, give up things, and I just didn't feel myself. And so I feel like if I were in a typical kind of deeply rooted traditional Asian culture, it would be like, you just suck it up and do it. Don't think about happiness, don't think about life, don't think about that. But I'm fortunate enough where my parents, I feel like, have given me a great installation of both the Eastern and Western values of finding that balance.
And what role has your cultural background played in shaping your leadership style and perspective as a business leader? And how have you found ways to use it as a strength in your career?
Yeah, it's a great question. I never, for many years of my life, I never was like, because I am Asian American, I blah, blah, blah. I feel like it's much more in the past couple of years. One, because, there is quite a lot happening with Stop Asian Hate. Unfortunately, I personally experienced an Asian hate moment in my neighborhood when my child was 9 months old while we were walking. And it really woke me up to take a platform and say something more. And so really, I would say now I realize that because I represent a lot of different communities, a working mother, or a working parent in general, a caretaker. I am an Asian American female. I project on the younger side. Sometimes people still think I'm like the new intern. I'm like, oh, actually, no. But, you kind of take all that in. And for two things, I think I've come to conclusion. One is, it is my responsibility to use my voice as a platform for those that may not have their voice, because I represent a certain faction and I need to make sure that I bear the responsibility to give voice to people who maybe don't have one. And then two, it's just being a little bit more aware of it. And also, if I find sometimes, an Asian American kind of, really hard worker, but a little bit more meek, doesn't speak up at meetings because they kind of, didn't grow up with different type of skill sets that were maybe challenged to them in a different way or just aren't natural to them. I really make it intentional to try to give them a platform or push them a little bit more, because I know that is a stereotype, and we can't continue to rise as a faction and culture and just add more value to things. But really, above all, is just being inclusive too. So it's really balancing the hat of how to be inclusive while also advocating for those who don't have a voice.
And now we'll move on to the final part of the podcast, talking about advice and inspiration. So what's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
My most recent boss, Ryan Ross, when I came back from maternity leave, we knew things were getting crazy. He's like, just a reminder to you all, he's like, you will learn more in the toughest times than you will in the easiest times. And and I can't believe it took me that long to realize that in my career, but he was so directive and so intentional about that message that I really was like, he is absolutely right. If I reflect on my entire career, I learned the most, not when times were easy, not when the stock market was booming and money was rolling in because everyone was spending like a drunk sailor, but when they weren't. And that's when you actually have to think so deeply on, how do I drive innovation while maintaining margin, while maintaining costs, you really find yourself in a balancing act versus just going through inertia and momentum. And so to me, that's still the best advice, and more recently, but also in hindsight, one of the best perspectives that one could build.
And what skills or qualities do you think are most important for someone looking to break into retail or the types of roles you had?
Yeah, I would say listening.
Mm.
I had someone who also once told me that you have one mouth and two ears for a reason. You should be listening twice as much as you speak.
Mm.
So to me, again, everything around customer retail is about the customer and what they feel and what they think and what they experience, and the associates at the front line who are there catching every single moment of elation, rejection, and all different emotions around the shopping experience.
Mm. And mentorship can play a huge role in one's success, as you briefly mentioned before. Did you have any key mentors or role models? And if so, what was some of the best advice that they gave to you that really had an impact on you?
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm so fortunate. Like literally at every role and company, even from investment banking when it was really hard, through Time magazines, through um, Ella Brands. I have just so many amazing mentors, and if anything, I probably haven't done as good of a job keeping in touch with all of them through the years as I would like, which I intend to catch up on now that I have some more free time and capacity,
Mm-hmm.
and have started to. But it really is just building those relationships along the way. So I can't say I was like seeking out a mentor.
Mm.
I just always loved to surround myself with people who would not only believe in me and be my sponsor, but also give me the cold hard truth about where I can improve.
Mm-hmm.
Because again, like someone could say all these nice things about you, but like, what are you going to learn from that? So, any advice I ever received that was good was one that really made me look in the mirror and made me think differently about who I am and how I wanted to project myself not only as a leader but as a general human from time to time.
Mm-hmm. And how do you define success now, and how has that definition changed since the beginning of your career?
Um, I feel like even just talking through all of this with you, it's like in the beginning of my career, it was very targeted. Like there is a role I'm going to do and an outcome I'm going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And over time, because also the expansiveness of your roles and responsibility, and especially the number of people I end up becoming ultimately responsible for, it's more about the sustainability of your choices and the legacy that you're going to drive.
Mm.
So it's not about just like hitting that number, knocking that product launch, kind of out of the park, finding ways to kind of, make your numbers, which are still important, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But you start thinking a lot more about, is this a decision a couple of years from now that I'm going to be proud of? Is this something that I know I want us as a team to stand for?
Mm.
So you start thinking a longer horizons on the sustainability and the legacy you're going to leave versus just the thing that you'll get to, put a star next to your name for.
Yeah. And for the last question, if you could leave listeners with one takeaway or piece of advice about building a meaningful and impactful career, what would it be?
There's no silver bullet. I feel like anytime I talk to someone, they're like, how did you do this? And like, what happened? How did you make these choices? As if I had the perfect plan. And I think that's also what is so challenging about being surrounded with social media like LinkedIn and even probably listening to my story here on the podcast. It's like, wow, she got it all figured out along the way. Nobody does.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if you are pursuing perfection, you are going to lose the opportunity to learn in the moment. And that's what really needs to happen. Take in the moment. Don't look so far ahead on what is the, don't focus so much on the race that you're trying to run, but really just more soak in classic of like stop and smell the flowers, but really stop and self-reflect. Sometimes take the time to reflect on yourself and take the time to learn, take the time to build relationships. Those will pay off in way higher dividends than trying to chase the perfect plan, because guess what? It just does not exist.
Mm. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I really appreciate your time. Lots of great answers. Love learning about your journey and pieces of advice. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ben. It's so great what you're doing as a platform to elevate the voices. So thank you for starting this and letting me be part of it.